Welcome to the Ben Wood Johnson podcast. You can visit Dr. Johnson's blog at benwoodpost.com. Dr. Johnson's works can be found at drbenwoodjohnson.com. You can also support Dr. Johnson on Patreon, the link to which is in the description. Hey, welcome to the Ben Wood Johnson podcast. Today is April 8, 2019. This is podcast number 25. I am so glad to have you with us one more time to talk about philosophy, to talk about the things that matter in life. As it happens, today we're going to be talking about a very important subject. We're going to talk about hate. What is hate? Now, this term is one of those terms that, people always talk about, but not necessarily have a good understanding of what the terms really means. Of course, some might say, well, hate is hate. Whenever we say hate, that's what it is. But I think we could look at the term from a philosophical standpoint. We could look at the term from a philosophical lens to understand what is hate in society, what induces hate, why people hate, and what leads them to behave in certain ways that some might say violent behavior. So hate, one could argue, is one of the feelings that induces behaviors in a person that, one could have never understood. So at the same time, we cannot talk about hate without talking about, the reason for hate. What leads to hate, what induces hate in human beings is not well understood. In this podcast, we're going to examine the term hate in terms of how it affects the individual and society as a whole. We're going to explore possible ways the term hate could be understood. So, without further ado, let us get right into it. People do not hate one another. I think this is one of the misconceptions of society. It is the understanding of what hate is. Now, one has to understand, what does the term hate mean? So in other words, it is important to grasp, what does hate entail when we say so-and-so hates this, or this individual hates that. What is implied by using this term? What is implied? Hate is a feeling of fear. However, men do not accept this understanding. Or should I say, men do not recognize this feeling. Men, there's this implied understanding that being afraid is not acceptable. It is not okay to be afraid. It is not okay to have feelings of fear. So as a result, there is a tendency, whether subconsciously or consciously, to hide such a feeling, to hide feelings that emanate or that evoke fear. And perhaps this intentional or sometimes unintentional behavior towards hiding what fear is also a way to hide what some might perceive as a weakness. It could be said that being afraid is the same as being weak, because when you are afraid, it is an acknowledgement, one way or another, of a sense of powerless, of a sense of incapacity, of a sense of inability. Thereby, being afraid could be understood as being incapable, being impotent, being in a position where one feels one has no power to stop or to contain whatever it is that one is afraid of at a particular time and place. So it is understandable that being afraid is the same as being weak. So when people are trying to hide their feelings of fear, it is also a way for them to hide the fact that they might feel incapable of resolving that feeling. Incapable, if you will, of stopping whatever it is that they feel is a potential, harm or is a potential danger for them. So in other words, men do not want to accept that they are weak. So to hide that weakness, men have a tendency to recoil, to fear. So there is no such a thing as hate. I know this is a bold statement to make, but if you agree with everything I have said here so far, you would understand where that statement comes from. Okay? The idea is that if we are to talk about hate, we also have to talk about fear, because one could not exist without the other. One has to be afraid before one can hate, because hatred is a symptom of a sense of fear. And that sense of fear is also the symptoms of a sense of incapacity, inability, impotence, if you will. But there's also another aspect of the term hate we have to sort of explain a little bit. For example, for a man to hate, a man would have to love. Now the question becomes, what is love? Of course, some people might say that love is the opposite of hate. Of course, it is not necessarily the case. But remember, we're looking at the concept from a philosophical standpoint, not necessarily from a psychological standpoint, okay? What I am saying here is simple. In order to hate, the person would have to love. Now, we have to define what love means, not in the terms of romantic love. That's not what I'm talking about here. I'm talking about if hatred incites violence or chaos, disorder, if hatred is this entity or this feeling that forces one to do things that one would not normally do, we have to look at the opposite, at least the presumed opposite of that hate. In this case, that would be love. So when one loves, one would have to do good, one would have to do everything righteous and not being part of chaos and violence and whatnot. Of course, one could argue that it is not necessarily the case. People do engage in violence as a condition, or people do engage in act of violence because they feel like they love, or in the name of love. People do incite chaos, disorder and whatever you want to call it, in the name of love as much as in the name of hate. So in this case, love is not necessarily the answer, which might explain why people hate, because the effects of hate could also incur as a result of love. The same thing one does when one hates, one could do the same thing when one loves. So somehow there ought to be a line that differentiates the two concepts. But in actuality, there is none. The hater is going to do the same thing as the lover. Not necessarily to the same person, not necessarily to the same group of people, but the lover is always going to do the same thing. And to give you an example, suppose that John calls himself a hater. Let's say John says, I hate this group of people or this type of people. John is probably going to behave in a way that suggests his intention, or perhaps his unintention, which does not necessarily take away the possibility that he might engage in a violent behavior against that group in the name of that hate. Okay. On the opposite end of the spectrum, John might say, well, I love this group or that group. In the name of that love, John might engage in the same behavior towards another group in order to protect the group that he so claims that he loves. So the same John who hates could engage in violent behavior towards a particular group in the name of that hate, but the same John could also engage in the same behavior towards another group in the name of love. But the behavior itself does not change because John either loves or hates another group. From the group's perspective, who is on the receiving end of John's behavior or conduct, if you will, it is the same behavior. Now, John could justify his behavior by saying this behavior is because I love that group, thereby whatever I do, I'm doing it in the name of love. Therefore, I am protecting that group that I so love, and I am doing all these things to this other group. Or John might say, well, I'm doing this to this other group because I hate that group. And I am equally justified to do hatred because I love, or I am equally justified to do hatred because I hate. So, as a philosopher, when I looked at those terms in terms of which of them has which effect, I don't see any difference. So there ought to be something else, and that is the reason I am convinced that it is a feeling of fear. Fear would definitely explain the reason John might behave a certain way towards a group, and it might also explain the reason he acts a certain way towards another group. Let us go back to the same examples I used before. Suppose that John says, I hate this group. You have to go into fundamentals of that feeling. If John happens to genuinely hate a group, the question one must ask is, why would John hate a particular group? And if you look underneath that hatred, you would probably see a sense of fear. John might hate that group because John is afraid that that group might hurt him or his family in one way or another. John might be afraid that that group might receive all the benefits or the privileges of the environment, the social environment where he involves. John might be afraid that this group might have the value or the worth that he so desires in this society, in this world, or in his environment. So coupled with that hatred is a feeling of fear. It does not have to be a fear of bodily harm, but John could explain his hatred of that group by expressing his fear of that group or his concerns for that group in one way or another. Okay. So in this case, fear, rightly so I might add, would explain why John hates. On the other hand, suppose that John says or claims that he loves that group, whatever that group is or might be. That feeling of love could also be understood as a feeling of fear. What that means is that John might love that group so much that he is afraid of losing that group. He is afraid of not having this group in his life. Okay? And that fear might also lead John to behave in a way that incites violence. Okay? So John could become a violent person or could engage in violent behavior simply because he's either love or hate. But underneath that love or hate, there's a feeling of fear a fear of lust, a fear of harm, a fear of prejudice, a fear of impotence, a fear of inferiority, a fear of inability, a fear of incapacity, a fear of not being able to perform, not to get, to receive, not to receive, to be, or not to be. So all of these types of fear, or at least all of these conditions, could invoke a fear in John. And as John hates, it might not be difficult to see that John is afraid. John is afraid of X, Y, or Z. Now, John would never admit that he is afraid. He is going to use that feeling of fear to justify his hatred of the other, or his so-called love for the other. But in both cases, fear would always be there. Again, my argument here does not hinge on any sense of contempt or agreement or disagreement, if you will, for either love or hate. No, I am a human being, obviously. I'm not a robot, but I am not justifying one feeling over another. I believe that the feeling of fear, the feeling of hate, or the feeling of love is somewhat personal. The individual has to be able to deal with these feelings on his own. Okay, it is not up to me to come to John, or to come up to John and say, John, you're not supposed to hate. It is not up to me to go to John and says, you are not supposed to hate. It is not up to me to go to John and says, you are not supposed to love, or you are supposed to love. Okay? It is up to John to look inside his soul, to look inside his self, his being, to analyze himself and understand the impacts of either hate or love, because at the end of the day, too much hate is going to lead to violence and chaos. And too much love is also going to lead to violence and chaos. So John has to be able to mitigate his feelings and recognize that, first of all, he is afraid. And he has to be able to surmount his fear, whatever that fear might be. He has to be able to understand the origins of his fear and rationalize his behavior in such a way that he does not let his emotions take over his behavior, take over his life. In one of my podcasts, I talked about how men are inherently emotional. The understanding that men are, at first, rational beings is false. It is a presumption that we, as entities, have come to, appreciate about ourselves, and we have learned to be that way when we are not necessarily that way. Nature did not create the human being to be rational at first. Nature did not create the person to be a rational being at first. So emotions always kick in. Emotions always precedes rationality. In other words, you are going to be emotional before you are rational. But in the midst of your emotionality, in the midst of your emotions, you have to be able to sense yourself, situate yourself, and become rational. We're not going to define what is rational. Sometimes that understanding itself is also subjective. But you ought to come to a point where you are able to gauge yourself in relation to others, and to gauge your behavior or their behavior in relation to others or in relation to you. Okay? So when you are in a situation where fear is taking over you, when you are in a situation where you are afraid, whether it is a fear of bodily harm, whether it is a fear of lust, it is a fear of an imminent danger, whether that danger might be mental, moral, psychological, or even physical. So whenever you find yourself in this situation of fear, you have to look inside your soul and try to situate that fear. Is it a fear that you cannot control? Is it a fear that you have the ability to walk away from? Could you walk away from that fear? Could you abandon the environment which is causing that fear? Could you stay away from the entity or entities creating that fear in you? These are questions the individual has to pose himself. You have to be able to step back and analyze yourself, analyze the situation, analyze why you are who you are and where you are. In doing so, you might be able to find a way to mitigate your fear and not to respond to it, not to engage in a behavior that is going to harm others, in which case your behavior is going to become a source of fear for others, in which case they might have to react to you because you are creating a sense of fear in them. So you have to be able to gauge yourself, gauge your community, gauge your environment, gauge whatever it is that you're feeling, and being able to respond accordingly. Do not let your fear becomes the entity that decides, or at least that traces your path in life. You have to command your fear. You have to understand where your fear comes from. What are the consequences of that fear? Also, you have to be able to conceptualize the consequences of your behavior towards that fear. It is never justifiable to behave in a certain way because you are afraid. There are always possibilities to mitigate your fear. Okay? And a man who masters his fear is a man who masters life. And being able to master life is quintessential in order to survive in this world. If you react to your fear in such a way that is not rational, that is purely emotional, then you are gambling your life. It is a gamble you're making. It is possible you might get away from whatever the harm, whatever it is that you might feel that is going to harm you. But you might also leave your skin in the process. You might also hurt others in the process. So it is important for you as a human being, as a man, to always be in tune to your reality. Always understand where certain feelings are coming from. And don't take it for granted the fact that you are first an emotional being. Don't take it for granted that being able to rationalize the world, it is not a given. You have to do some work. You have to put in some effort to try to understand your situation, try to understand your reality, and react accordingly. Do not let your fear become your guide. Because if you do, you are going to become a source of fear for others. And in such a way, you might feel the need to react against your fear, which might be disguised under either your hatred or your love. But bear in mind that others might feel the need to react against you based on the way you behave yourself towards them. And this is the perfect recipe for chaos and social disorder.